Welcome everybody. We really appreciate you coming to our session. This session is teaching students to transgress against racial, gender, and sexual boundaries, education as freedom and liberatory praxis. As you will see, most of the work that we're going to be discussing today is based off the work of bell hooks. This is one of my favorite quotes that bell hooks in her text that I've come across. The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. And before we get started, I just want to offer a quick positionality statement. You'll notice that this presentation reflects bell hooks' work, but filtered through two white women. Both Brittany and I occupy a different axis of identity than bell hooks. So I absolutely encourage you all to seek out and read bell hooks' work if this presentation interests you, and if you find that you want to start incorporating transgressive teaching approaches in your classrooms. But before we get started, I do want to talk a little bit about just some considerations. There is some controversy surrounding bell hooks recently. She has made some comments about Beyonce specifically as it relates to Black feminist thought and intersectionality. And so following Beyonce's Time cover, it was a controversial statement that bell hooks said that not only was Beyonce anti-feminist, but also categorized her as a terrorist in terms of the impact that her work has on young girls, young Black girls specifically. And bell hooks also has criticized Beyonce's visual album Lemonade, and talking about how Beyonce exploits the images of Black female bodies. And I just want to bring this up because it is possible that if you use bell hooks' work in your class, or if you bring up bell hooks in your teaching pedagogy, in your teaching statements, that you may encounter some responses that are not positive, because there is a little bit of controversy surrounding her recent statements about Beyonce. But regardless of your stance, I think we can all agree that both bell hooks and Beyonce have contributed to the intersectional feminist conversation, and both perspectives are worth our time. I just wanted to note that in case you have students who come up to you and say, well, what about bell hooks' comments about Beyonce, and how is that situated within intersectionality and Black feminist criminology specifically? So the goal of this workshop is to discuss strategies for educating students as a practice of freedom. We're going to focus specifically on racial, sexual, and gender boundaries later in our Q&A and in our open forum. And that's based on this teach-in's overall goal, as well as our what the DWC kind of stands for. I first became aware of bell hooks' work through my certificate program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She has an article in the Yale Journal of Law and Feminism that was called Theory as Liberatory Practice. And it really focused on how to incorporate theory into practice. And I found that really fascinating as a master's student. Brittany, I'm going to ask you to keep an eye on the chat, just because I cannot I can't multitask, if that's all right with you.
Got it. I'm trying to multitask too, so.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And then this summer, I re-engaged her works, specifically these three texts, after a student in my feminist criminology class. We read some of bell hooks' article work, and that student said, oh, have you read Teaching to Transgress? And I hadn't. At that point, I had read Teaching Critical Thinking. And so then I re-engaged all of her texts, and I've really been kind of thinking about her ideas and her work, and it's really influenced how I've taught. So I'm going to assume that not everybody in the chat today or in the Zoom call today has read bell hooks' work, and so this session is going to be it's three components. I'm going to give a brief overview of what it actually means to educate as a practice of freedom through bell hooks' work, what it means to teaching to transgress, give a brief overview of things that have worked in my classroom. We're going to show some videos so you can actually hear bell hooks talk about these topics and issues, because again, I just want to say that, this is me interpreting her work. And so of course, it's instructive to return to her work as well and to show you all that. And so what is educating as a practice of freedom? Well, Bell Hooks says that it's to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students, and that is essential if we want to provide the conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. It requires primarily being authentic and being committed to social justice and praxis. We'll talk about how these issues directly impact our discipline, specifically in criminal justice and victimology. And importantly, Bell Hooks stresses that to teach through a lens of freedom, that educators must view themselves and their students as human beings in an effort to educate students in a non-threatening and anti-discriminatory way. Educating as a practice of freedom doesn't necessarily come easy to everybody, and Bell Hooks acknowledges that it does come easier to some folks based on their ideologies and their view of themselves as educators. And so it comes easiest to educators who believe that there is something sacred about our work, or an aspect of our work that is sacred, and that our work is not merely to share information with students, but to share in their spiritual and intellectual growth as well. And, you know, everyone in this room is here for a reason, and I'm sure that we can all fall under these descriptions in one way or another. And kind of moving on, educating as a practice of freedom is intrinsically tied to transgressive teaching approaches, which I'm going to talk about next. And so what does it mean to teach students to transgress? Well, Bell Hooks says that teaching students to transgress against boundaries, meaning to recognize that gender boundaries, racial boundaries, sexuality boundaries are false boundaries that only limit to oppress and marginalize, can provide a gift of freedom. And she situates this idea within the classroom because she believes that teaching and the classroom are sites where everyone can become more engaged in liberation, in social justice, and that also teaching is a performative act where we can create spaces for change, innovation, and progress. So although teaching people and students to transgress happens in different settings, not just in the classroom, that the classroom is a site where it can be the most meaningful. So what does this have to do with our discipline? Well, I see it being intimately tied to critical criminological and critical victimological approaches. And so when I'm talking about critical criminology, I'm primarily talking about queer, critical race, lat crit, feminist approaches, because these approaches recognize and argue that there are matrices of domination, systems of oppression that exist, sexism, misogyny, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other systems of oppression, and that they are endemic to society. These critical approaches also stress that educators must remain committed to social justice and praxis. And this is evidence in the Critical Criminology Journal that did an entire special issue on activist criminology. And so there's definitely a connection between kind of critical approaches and then Bell Hooks' ideas of transgressing in the classroom. When we think about teaching to transgress, one of the primary points is that teaching students to transgress moves beyond goals of simple literacy or the development of professional skills. Yes, we are in the classroom to teach students an array of topics and to help them develop the tools necessary to succeed in their future professions, but that also you need to promote a reflexive and critical view of social realities. And so you can see a list of those social realities above. And so asking students to reflect and to kind of think outside the box or open their mind and think about sexism, racism, misogyny, and homophobia, transphobia is part of that transgressive teaching approach, which is very much connected to critical criminology and victimological teaching approaches. And of course, it would be outside the scope of this 1 hour to tell you everything I love about Bell Hooks' work. And so I'm gonna focus today on kind of 4 areas that I think have helped me most and that apply to both the undergraduate and the graduate learning environment. And so we're gonna talk about knowledge production, linking theory to practice and personal experience, centering student power, empowerment, and then advocating for social justice. So I always start all of my semesters, whether it's an undergraduate, master's, or PhD level course, talking about knowledge production. And I assign a 2-page editorial from the journal Social Work by Anne Hartman that's called Many Ways of Knowing. And this is on the reading list if you want to start to incorporate this in your classrooms. And really, for the first week of class, I have students investigate sources of knowledge. So who has been historically denied access to the academy? What has the academy looked like over history? Primarily androcentric, male stream, white professors and students. And then we talk about, well then, because of this social historical reality, whose stories have been erased? We talk about who is allowed to produce knowledge. So based on different social hierarchies, whose knowledge is seen as fact and whose knowledge is seen as mere experience, and why do those things, why does that kind of categorization happen? We ask questions like, well, what is truth? Can we ever know truth? And Anne Hartman says, is there even such thing as truth, and may we ever know it? And what we learn in college is that actually tapping into truth. And I teach gender and crime, and so as some of us may know on this call, that research to date has by and large neglected to investigate women, trans, and non-binary folk in a meaningful way, really until the 70s, until the second wave feminist movement. And still that is problematic in some ways in terms of, intersectionality and not incorporating the experiences of all women and things like that we'll talk later about. And so we talk about, well, what is truth? Who produces knowledge? And we'll read articles about knowledge production. And usually this goes really well. And students respond with learning that, there are different ways to access truth. It's not necessarily just in a research article, but art can be a mechanism of conveying truth, that counter stories, that storytelling can be a way of gaining access to truth, and that indeed there are many ways of knowing. And I think opening classes and opening semesters with this initial kind of question everything that you learn in this class, question who produces this knowledge, question whose voices may be left out, set the stage for a more critical and meaningful semester. So the next thing that I always try to incorporate in my class, which relies on bell hooks teaching, is that to link theory to practice. And not necessarily practice as it relates to working in the criminal legal system, although that absolutely counts, but also practice in terms of social justice advocacy. So in my initial lectures to students where I'm introducing myself, I do talk about my activism and how I agitate for social justice. I'll show pictures of myself at marches. I'll show pictures of myself at student-run kind of demonstrations. So for example, at Sam Houston State University, I helped clubs organize a blackout game to stand against police brutality, where everybody who went to the basketball game wore black as a symbolic statement. And so I kind of try to set this groundwork that, I don't just teach this, I also practice it. And what I find is really interesting is often criminal justice students think that theory is not necessarily practice. Like they'll always say, oh, I can't wait to get past this theory component and get to the actual information. And bell hooks would, say that there's really nothing more practical than a good theory. And of course it can't replace, that experience cannot replace what is best taught in the classroom, that these things need to kind of come hand in hand. And this is often best, best accomplished through active learning approaches. And so as opposed to kind of a lecture format. And so I always try to include some active learning approaches in my classes to link that theory to practice. But most importantly, you can leverage your students as student teachers. I'm actually going to go back to this one quote. Through dialogue, the teacher of the students and the students of the teacher cease to exist, and a new term emerges. Teacher-student with students, teachers. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is themselves taught. I had to change that because it said himself. in dialogue with the students, who in turn is also being taught to teach. And so we have an interesting situation in our discipline because we often have students in our classes who work in criminal legal professions. And so this is a good way to shift power and to demonstrate that you buy into the fact that there are many ways of learning. And just because I'm the professor with a PhD doesn't mean that I'm the best situated to discuss all topics. And we know that real world learning and kind of linking theory to practice is an important pedagogical strategy. It helps college students develop as professionals who are able to deal with real world problems. It also helps, research shows that students learn best from direct experiences combined with guided reflection and analysis. And I think that's an important component of education as liberatory practice, is that it's not necessarily just talking about personal experiences, but it's linking that personal experience to theory and then trying to aim to transform students' previous understanding. And so often students will provide a direct experience of working in the criminal legal system, and then me as the facilitator of the discussion will try to connect that somehow to theory so students can actively see how these things are connected. And so what does a classroom that integrates theory and practice look like? Suggestions include that, the educator set a tone for class participation. And this tone emphasizes that students will have varying opinions, experiences, and beliefs, and that students should respect each other's voices. And, I tend to be pretty authentic in the classroom, and it's probably very clear my beliefs that, that I'm a feminist, that I'm anti-racist, that, definitely my personality shines through. But I'm always happy to see that on teaching evaluations that students often say that even though Dr. O'Neill is a liberal feminist, she was always very, like it's a bad thing, she was always very responsive to my opinions and never put me down. And so I think that as it should say an educator, we need to model this behavior. And the way that I do that is through normalizing statements. So when a student may say something that runs counter to either my personal ideologies or political beliefs, I will often respond with a normalizing statement, meaning that kind of showing the class and demonstrating to the class that you may know that this is not necessarily what I believe, but I can respect what you're saying. And of course, this doesn't apply to any hostile or violent conversations that happen in the classroom. This is mostly when people are offering maybe a counter argument to something that I'm talking about, but it's in a respectful way. It also helps if we draw on our own personal and practical experience. Bell Hooks really advocates for being authentic and genuine in the classroom and bringing your whole self to work, because you can't expect this of students if you yourself are not modeling this behavior. And so, I don't have practical experience in terms of my working, but I have volunteered at rape crisis centers. I have volunteered as a court-appointed special advocate, and I have been active in grassroots advocacy efforts. And so I'll often share those experiences as a way to combine practice and theory. But I also will rely on guest speakers. So that could be bringing in someone from a police department or from a corrections department to talk to the class. And I also offer students to be teachers in the classroom. So if I have a student who is very actively engaged and often speaks up about their practical experience. My university is situated in one of the largest prison areas in the United States. And so I often have a handful of students who are correctional officers, and I'll ask them, do you want to have 30 minutes of one of our classes to discuss your experiences as it relates to gender and crime, which is what I teach. And typically students really like that, and both to present and to be seen as an expert. And also students in the audience appreciate it because it further demonstrates that I believe that I am not the only person contributing to this learning environment. So from here, I'm gonna pass it on to Brittany.
Okay, so we wanted to incorporate a few videos into the presentation, and one of the things that really resonated with me was this idea of bringing the personal experience into the classroom. And I can for sure say, looking back, when I first started teaching, like, how do I do that? Like, no, they can't know anything about me, but the recognition, right, that we are humans and that our students are humans too. And so I thought this short clip was really great in terms of within less than 2 minutes, Bell Hooks weaves in this really personal experience within the broader topic that she's talking about. So go ahead, Erin. It's not working.
It's not? Oh, that's weird. It's working on mine. Interesting. Okay.
It's like
I was watching it and enjoying it.
Share audio when you share your screen.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
You have to click a little box that says share audio when you share your screen. There's a little box.
Ah, let me see. Okay.
Left of the share screen.
The left of the share screen. Oh my gosh. See, this is what happens when I practice and I think I know what's going on. Okay, so 1 second. Do you see my screen still?
It's like stuck on the video, but yeah, we can still see the PowerPoint.
I don't see a Karen. Okay, let me see. Can someone tell me again where the?
You can stop.
Oh, okay, never mind. I see. I got it. Thank you. Okay, sorry guys. All right, or sorry y'all. Let me try this again.
We have to change the scale of evaluation, because if we continue to judge ourselves by the standards set within that imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, then we never move. Because even if we move, but we still have what I call the voice of judgment. My theory is that the dominating culture depends on the voice of judgment. You know, that even when you're succeeding, you're not good enough. Even when, you know, I didn't think I was a writer, even after I had books published. Because, you know, for me, you know, what did I think a writer would be? What would be the magic moment that I could say, I'm a writer? And that whole thing had to do with my needing some type of validation outside myself to give me power, and not to be able to think of, you know, power that I can give myself, that we can self-generate. And I worry, and I talked a little bit, and we're not going to talk about Black Lives Matter tonight, but I was saying sometimes I worry because so many of our energies of protest and resistance are outer directed. You know, last night I asked the audience, what if we took away all the police brutality in our society against black males? Would black males be self-actualized? Is it really police brutality that is keeping black males from, you know, I mean, I mentioned my brother last night, how my father used to say to him, Glory, to me, Glory, your brother ain't worth a nickel. And he loved putting my brother down. I mean, it's amazing that my brother could come out of addiction. You know, when I hear people like putting little black children and boys, especially, you stupid, you dumb, down, you think, how will that person empower themselves from that? How are we healing from that? And this particular conversation has to do with moving from pain to power. And that's really what we want to discuss about how do we, as people from oppressed and exploited groups, find our way to joy, find our way to emotional well-being, to healing.
Was her head cut off for you all?
Yeah, but you can still hear it well.
Okay, I did test all of this. I don't know why it was looking great this morning, so I apologize for that. I will also send the links to those videos where you can actually see her wonderful eyes. Okay, so yeah, that was a great example of how in the span of 2 minutes, she incorporated some personal information about her previous home life. And this is important because it can help establish trust between you and your students. Students often see professors as kind of these just folks that teach them that don't necessarily have home lives, that, you know, just kind of live and breathe teaching. And that can cause some unnecessary barriers because they don't see us as, you know, actual human beings. And so incorporating personal experience and kind of letting down that guard can often create a more transgressive and critical teaching environment. And so the next concept that is really important to teaching to transgress is centering student empowerment in your classroom. And all this really means is encouraging students to transcend beyond inactive information recipients to dynamic participants in their own educational process. This is more challenging in some learning environments than others. I, for one, teach a 200-seat lecture format gender and crime class, and then also smaller sections that have between 25 and 50 students. And so I'll admit that in a 200-seat lecture, this can be more challenging because it's more comfortable for me to just kind of lecture to 150 students and then kind of send them on their way. And so we can talk later about ways that I've incorporated you know, having a student-centered classroom, even in a big lecture hall. And I think I've been pretty successful. And really, so what does centering student empowerment look like? Well, it really incorporates students' voice in the creation of the class and how the class is run. It centers self-discovery, like we talked about before, you know, combining textbook learning also with intellectual and spiritual growth. And research finds that when students are given space to have a say in their learning, that they do use their curiosity to solve real-world problems and to learn more about the topic. And so you can give students, you can empower students and center student empowerment by giving a say to students and how they learn. So for example, I have reading quizzes, I have multiple choice exams, and then I have 3 writing assignments. One which is an infograph, which is more creative, a double entry journal, which is more kind of reading focused, and then a book review where they choose a book to review. And across all these assignments, I drop their lowest grade. And this allows me to have more expansive assessment tools that take into consideration that students perform differently on different assignments, and that doesn't necessarily convey to me whether they're understanding the material or getting the material. And so having a wide variety of assessment tools is also a good strategy for centering student empowerment and giving them a say in how they learn. And so when students know that maybe they're not that good at creatively, so creating an infograph, they know going into it that if they perform poorly on that assignment, it will be dropped. You can also give students a say in what they learn. And so for example, this semester in my gender and crime class, I leave 2 weeks, which is about 4 meetings, without a lesson plan. And in the beginning of the semester, I asked students to kind of keep their ears open for things they may want me to cover later in the semester. And then I'll revisit at the 5th week mark, does anyone have any ideas for what we should cover later in the semester? And so for this semester, one of my students said that they would like to talk about Say Her Name and the WNBA participating in the racial justice conversation. And I thought that that was really innovative. I myself, not being a basketball fan, but I should be now that I've read all of this about the WNBA, that really provided a fun way to incorporate what students want into the assignment, and it very much fits in with, you know, gender and crime. And so you can maybe think about incorporating that. Leave a few days that are blank, and then ask students to pretty much tell you what they want to learn. You can include students when designing the learning space, and so in a traditional classroom, this involves like where you're going to all sit in a kind of a circular seats and have a more seminar style discussion. And you know, you can't really do that in a larger class where it's amphitheater style, but that is a component of centering student empowerment. And importantly, and then I'm going to move on, is teaching students how to provide feedback to their fellow students and to the professor is a great tool that will not only enhance the classroom environment, but also enhance their professional skills. So when you have multiple people who are engaging in classroom discussion, and you're not only facilitating the discussion, but then also giving feedback to your students So for example, hey Dave, I love how you said that. However, maybe you could have done it XYZ to kind of soften your response so it wasn't so abrasive. I know that that wasn't your intention, but you could see how it was misconstrued. And so you're also, you know, providing them tools to have meaningful dialogue and discussion as you're having classroom discussions. Brittany?
Yep, it zoomed in on her face again, so we might get some weird lag. That's okay.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. So we picked this one because it really focuses on our voice can have power and how to use that and encourage our students to think what our voice represents, where you're coming from, but then also how to include others within that voice as well.
You hear a lot of people say their daughters, feminism worked, and their daughters are fine. What do you think?
Well, I think that, you know, I've always been sort of more opposed to the idea that one can determine the degree of liberation of girls by whether or not they talk a lot. Because I've always said that certainly traditional Jewish women and African American women have always been very vocal, but it hasn't corresponded to a real liberatory vision of voice. Oh, and I think that that's why so often Jewish women and black women get that stereotype of the angry, bitchy voice, because it's often not a liberating voice. It's often a very critical, demeaning of others' voice, and so it's not the voice of power. And I think that we have to reconfigure the idea of what is the voice of power, of liberatory power, and that's the voice that is capable of valuing oneself rightly and speaking from that position. And so to me...
And also cherishing the other.
Exactly. So when I see a group of girls, it's not necessarily the girl who is talking loudest or strongest that embodies that power of voice, but that girl who is able to state clearly where she's coming from and include where she's coming from a recognition of others.
And so before we move on to the open discussion, there's one more point I want to talk about, which has really helped me in the classroom to embody transgressive and teaching pedagogical approaches, is advocating for social justice on campus and beyond. And we can talk about this in a few minutes. Do we have a responsibility as educators to agitate for social change? There are people who feel differently about this subject. I feel strongly in one direction, other people may feel strongly in the other, and that's okay, and we'll talk about that. Bell Hooks would say absolutely, that if you are in the classroom, whether it's K through 12 or in the college atmosphere, that you have a duty to advocate for social change and to break down systems of oppression. And, you know, she says that the educational system is currently a place where imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal ideologies are upheld. And she says that we need to, as educators, break down that current structure and instead build an educational system where students are encouraged to open their minds, engage in rigorous study, and to think critically. And so her other two textbooks, or her other books on thinking, critical thinking and teaching community, engages these ideas about kind of transcending your teaching beyond the classroom to advocating for social justice. Brittany?
Nobody posted questions. So we were going to leave time open for questions you all might have, but then we also, the prompts went away, Erin.
I know, I'll bring them back up. First, does anyone have any just general questions for Brittany or I? All righty. Okay, I'll bring back up the, oh wait, here we go.
Yeah.
About implementing these ideas in large classrooms. So I talked about this a little bit in a previous section. I've incorporated what I'm calling social justice seminars in my classrooms where students are encouraged to couple current events articles with the articles that we're reading in class that are academic. And so, for example, early in the semester, we read a article on data feminism and how big data and data practices don't necessarily access truth. And then we read a current events article on predictive policing in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And so it was all about how Los Angeles Police Department had dismantled their predictive policing algorithm software because biases were present in those algorithms. And so we have more of a kind of more informal discussion about a current events article. And that seems easier in a large section because students are more willing to engage with a short article than they are, with maybe a textbook chapter or an academic article.
I'll talk more just generally about some of the things that I've done in the big lecture. I really focus on that personal experience. And one of the things Bell Hooks talks about in the book as well is in academia, we kind of try to separate the mind and the body. And the semester that I was pregnant, that no longer became possible, right? This idea that I could just go teach and do all this other stuff. And so I think that's just even within the 200-person class, like a step to it. The other thing that she talks about is giving students voice, and that's really difficult in a 200-person class. And so one of the ways in which I try to do that is have the students talk to one another. And if they don't, like, you can always see the one student who's not talking, and I hobble over to them and I say, hi, like, how are you? And one semester that student really struggled, and I was able to connect him to resources, and another student started working with him. And so even just things like that can really make a difference in a student's career or tenure at a school. One of the other questions that popped in, I think this is a really interesting one, is how to do this within research methods.
I can talk first. Yeah. So full disclosure, I haven't taught research methods, but I have mentored my PhD students who are currently teaching research methods. And so, for example, I use, one of the textbooks I use in my other classes is Data Feminism. And it is a popular press book that talks about really biases in data. And this really gets students thinking differently, because students often see kind of like data as being, truth, or that data cannot be manipulated, or that data always tells an objective story. And that necessarily isn't always true. And so I also talk in my research class about how data are always rhetorical and how data can always be persuasive. And there's a really great example that is out of USA Today where they did employment rates as if presented by kind of a more liberal writer or a more conservative writer. And the way in which those unemployment rates were packaged told a very different story. And so we can say that, data never speak for themselves, although students often like to think that they do. And so that's one way that I incorporate these ideas. Jace, did you have any particular questions about research methods courses?
That was generally what I was getting at, is that because in research methods, we actually are teaching, that specific form of knowledge and that specific way of thinking and everything. And I do start off my semester by talking a little bit about knowledge, and there's different ways of knowing, but then you are spending that whole semester really emphasizing this particular scientific way of developing knowledge, right? So it just immediately struck me as one area where it would be maybe more challenging, right, than in other courses for this format. But I really love your feedback, what you said. Is that book, or can you share those examples? Do you have those like in that list or anything?
Yep. All every piece of scholarship that I've referenced is in the reading list.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
One of the things I did when I taught research methods, and it's been a few years, was I had students pick a particular topic. And so it could have been, let's say, intimate partner violence, and they had to find a survey article, an experiment, and then a qualitative study, all within this broad top. And so I met with each one of them so that you're also meeting individually with the students, but then they can see how that research question shifts and shapes even within the same header. And so you're also like exposing them to qualitative research as well within the research methods course, because sometimes I find the books don't always do such a great job at going over the different forms of qualitative research.
I have one more comment. Jace, I think it would also be cool to talk about, and maybe you already do this, how the ways in which we write questions can unintentionally erase people. And so I use an example in one of my classes about how Facebook used to only have a gender binary choice, male or female, in the presentation of how you presented yourself to the world. And now when you sign up, you still have to choose a gender binary, which is problematic, but they have a broader list of genders that you can put on your profile. And so we talk about how if they had remained in this one way, how would that maybe unintentionally erased a lot of people? And so maybe that could also be a way that you can incorporate these concepts into a research methods class.
Okay, yeah, cool, thanks. Maybe I am doing more of this than I thought, because I definitely do teach qualitative methods, and I always use gender as my example when I teach conceptualization and operationalization. I sometimes get pushback from people who don't like learning about gender identity, but tough nuggets like, so, okay, thank you. I feel better.
Yeah. And absolutely, when I first engaged Bell Hook's work, it more gave me the vocabulary to describe what I was already doing in the classroom and to provide a more kind of theoretical understanding of it and more, I guess, how to do it better. But yes, I agree. We're likely already all doing this in our classrooms. And so do we want to move on to our discussion questions, Brittany?
Well, we got two questions. So one might be a quick answer, so I'll do them both. Do you have students give feedback on their infographics? And then what do you see as the next steps for taking these ideas further?
So this is the first semester that I'm incorporating infographics in my class based on the amazing Brie Bopri, sorry if I butchered that, Brie Bopri. And so that's still up for debate. I don't know. So right now I'm in a kind of interesting teaching situation where we're kind of hybrid. I'm face-to-face, but I'm also online. So I'm still trying to navigate the best ways to kind of deal with that. But I think it would be a good idea to have students engage with each other's infographics so they can see what is being produced by their students. And also it's another way to learn more information. They could learn, 200 topics from that. So I think that's a good idea.
And then your next steps.
My next steps are just to always be learning and always improving my teaching strategies. Sometimes I reflect back on my first few years as an assistant professor and I cringe and I think, oh, wow, my students, they really missed out because I'm a much better educator now than I was. And so really my next steps is just, I'm always trying to learn more and incorporate what I learned. But at the end, it's really just, for me, being authentic and genuine in the classroom usually accomplishes what students need. Is that if I'm just being authentic, because I have their best interests and I have their education in mind, that, it pretty much usually works out. So the more educated I become just on these topics, the better teacher I become. That's pretty much a non-answer, but.
You always have the right way with words though, so it's all right. I think one of the-
pray. Oh, sorry.
One of the challenges, because I was teaching the 200-person class for the last 6 years, was how to get that student voice in. And so at my new institution, the classes will be much smaller, and that's definitely something that I'm personally trying to focus on, of making sure that I hear every single student's voice at some point throughout the semester. Looks a lot different now that everything's online, but what that will look like face-to-face, I'm really excited about. So I guess we can move on to, does anyone else have any other questions?
Or comments?
Yeah. You can like turn yourselves off too and talk.
All right, we're gonna go back. We did write some questions to hopefully
Or if you all,
encourage discussion. Do you see it?
yep.
Okay.
So the first one is that Bell Hooks asserts that teachers have a vision of, you know, a democratic education, and everything is all cut off because Erin moved all her things and I didn't.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
No,
See?
it's my fault.
And okay, so I will read.
Yeah.
Bell Hooks asserts that teachers of vision know that democratic education can never be confined to the classroom. What do we take away from this assertion? What does it mean for you? In what ways do your teaching styles transcend the classroom? Or if we don't like this more structured, you know, discussion questions, we can just, you know, we can just talk about more openly, just, you know, what do you all want?
Or ways that you've incorporated like personal experience in the classroom that have worked, or sometimes the best examples are what doesn't work and kind of what you've learned in terms of moving forward with that.
Megan?
Hiya. So one of the things that worked for me, this is weird. One of the things that worked for me was I teach policing, and policing, one of those, for me, it's an easy course. That's all I do for the most part. And so there's a limited number of topics that are gonna come up, relatively speaking. But knowing that, I know what everything is gonna be kind of put into. So I've started coming to first day of class with half a syllabus. And so I know broadly what we're gonna be talking about, but then I'm like, all right, everybody pass out note cards. I don't know what, I think I'm probably gonna do a Google form. What do you wanna learn about? What do you wanna talk about? And we have to cover certain things. We're absolutely going to cover certain things. But that gives me an opportunity to kind of shape the class as to what they're looking for as well. But again, we're still covering the same topics. We're just spending more time on community relations, or we're spending more time on use of force, or we're spending more time on whatever. And that's worked really well in terms of like centering it around the student, kind of a collaborative teaching environment. So they seem to like it a lot too.
Can I pop in with a question of how, I guess you just leave it blank when you submit your syllabus for the, you know how you have to submit syllabus at the beginning of the semester? It's just, I've always had to send it to like somebody who posts it somewhere. I don't know where it goes, but it has to be done by a certain date.
We're kind of loosey-goosey on the East Coast. I don't know.
That's a Texas State University thing, I believe. I believe that we're required to have our qualifications and syllabi available.
Well, no, we post that, like I send it to my chair eventually when I remember. So they have those syllabi, but I send the complete version. So it doesn't have to be before class starts. And like I wrote about it in my annual review about this is what hey Dean, this is what I'm doing now. I got positive feedback from the dean on it as well. So, but again, East Coast, maybe we're loosey-goosey with things. I don't know. But yeah, that's, you know, and eventually, and then it does create kind of more work and like rushing to finish something, because because I want it to them by the like second day of class, if not sooner. So we meet and then I go home and like create the syllabus essentially. But again, I have all of these readings just readily available. I have the textbooks I can pull from. So it's just a matter of like spreading out the calendar of how I want things, and when am I going to have a test? When am I going to have, you know, things like that. So it takes, you know, an evening up to an extra day maybe of putting things together, but it's been kind of fun. And I've seen more engagement from students, just generally speaking, of speaking up and talking in class, because I'm guessing, I haven't studied, that there's more ownership of the class.
And that they care about the topics.
Yeah.
So we only have about 9 minutes left. Brittany, do you mind if we do the second question? Because this is just, I'm just curious about everybody's beliefs about this question. How do you feel?
I told you last night, I love that one, so.
Okay, so Bell Hooks discusses how educators can teach, value, and learn from works written by racist and sexist authors. How do we feel about this assertion? Have we ever incorporated racist or sexist work in the classroom as a critical thinking exercise? And then I'm gonna turn on, I'm gonna stop screen sharing so I can see everybody. I have done this. We read White Fragility, the article, which is very controversial and is not, you know, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. And I was wondering how you all feel about this approach, and do you see utility? What are some possible consequences?
I actually approached the topic a little differently, but with the same concept. So in my graduate level domestic violence course, I have them read a book by the musician James Brown. His daughter writes about how she grew up with him being a domestic violence abuser to her family, to her, and then she finds herself in unhealthy relationships as well. So she kind of works through that in the book. And so rather than sort of thinking about the writer being someone who is racist or sexist, she's writing about those experiences and how someone views her father to be this incredible, you know, contribution to music, but how her perception is different. And so I set that tone to talk about what is it like when we idolize or we respect individuals and then we find out histories about them. So I use it in a slightly different way, but the students are really challenged to kind of think about what's happening currently with different individuals and in the past. So I've had really good conversations, but from a different context than what you suggested.
Yeah, I love that. When Kobe Bryant was killed or died, we had similar discussions about, you know, his history and what that meant for survivors of sexual assault. But that also in Los Angeles, where I'm from, he is a pillar of hope and growth for the Black community. And I had students who were really having a hard time reconciling the artist from the art. So I really like that. Dana, can you send me that article?
It's actually a book called Cold Sweat, but I'll post it.
Perfect, thank you.
So I have to wonder, when you have done this critical thinking exercise, has it ever happened that a student sort of missed the point?
Yes, and that happens more at the undergraduate level than it does in master's or PhD level. So I often let them know that this is a piece that has very controversial and potentially traumatizing assertions, and that it's meant to be a critical thinking exercise. So I always let them know that the work is problematic. And so, for example, there was an article published that was called "The Irrelevance of Queer Criminology" by Mike Adams. And it talked all about how really there was no need for feminist criminology or queer criminology. And so absolutely, I don't want to re-traumatize my students by exposing them to these ideas that they may take as fact because they're published in an academic journal. And so I tell them that this is problematic and this is not right, I mean, to be honest.
I will say in the 2 weeks in class, I've always been surprised too, by like halfway through the semester, the students, when they take ownership in the course, if there is that problematic student, it becomes less challenging. And because it's 5 o'clock on Friday, I probably didn't explain that answer very well.
I also find it as a useful tool because it shows students that things can get published that maybe shouldn't have been published. And so it also circles back to that idea of what is truth. Just because something's in an academic article or academic journal or in a textbook doesn't necessarily mean, because this is a contemporary piece too that I'm talking about. This isn't something that was published, you know, in the 60s that we can say, oh, well, you know, it's the socio-historical context. No, this was something that was very contemporary. And so it also gets students to think about, well, that knowledge production component and that truth component as well. And so it also ties in nicely to that. Yeah, so Danielle, oh, that was a private message, never mind. Well, that's, you know, we have 4 more minutes left, and I think people are kind of going to jump into the other. Oh, Megan has her hand raised.
No, I forgot to take it down. I apologize. I'm shamed appropriately.
Thank you both for doing this. I haven't read Bell Hooks' book in quite a while, so it was a really good refresher and recommitment to her pedagogy. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming, and you know, please reach out if you want the reading list or if you want to talk more about these ideas. You know, I'm always down.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone being here.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Alrighty, I'm going to stop recording.